Welcome to Driven to Lead. I'm your host, Wayne Brandon. In this series, we explore the real world stories of key executives to find the leadership lessons that help move us all forward. If you like these conversations, we'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe and like button. It'll help us out a lot. But now we got another great program for you today, so let's make it happen. I'm really happy to have Michael Pine on the program this morning. He's the CEO and founder of Pine Health Strategies, a fractional CBO firm, CBO being a chief business officer. He's got incredible experience for 25 years across the pharmaceutical and biotech space. He's worked with companies that you're going to recognize the names of, like Pfizer and Novartis, and some smaller ones, but also significant: Oregon, Lupin, Cos, Arles, Medius, pardon my pronunciation on those. And most recently with iPoint. At iPoint, Michael led the transition of the company from being a pharmaceutical company to being a thriving biotech with an ophthalmology asset. And he has a list of awards here, too numerous to read, including Business Excellence Awards from Novartis. He's an active speaker across the space. And the first guest we've had on this program in the pharmaceutical and biotech space. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Wayne. Great to be here.
You know, we explore leadership lessons on this program, so we're going to get into that in a little bit. But because you're the first guest in this space, maybe you can fill us in on what a chief business officer does, because I know you're providing your services now to multiple firms, people reaching out to you for advice and direction. What is the position that you hold? Why is it critical in this industry?
Yeah, and it's a relatively new term, chief business officer. It's something that a lot of people have different definitions for, depending on what the needs are for a company. But the most general definition I could give for the pharma and biotech industries is it's the business development and strategy function. So it's the person that's responsible for thinking about how the company's going to look years from now, right? There's people in the company that are focused on developing assets. There's people in the company that are focused on selling the assets. This is the person that's focused on what assets do we need, which ones don't we need, what should we sell, what should we buy. So it's a little bit more like a licensing function or an M&A function, almost like an internal investment banker at times. But they're thinking about, how to shape the company for the future, and they're actually executing on it. So they're the ones that are out there finding the assets, evaluating them, negotiating for them, and very often serving as the alliance manager as well.
Yeah, okay, that helps a lot, because in your extensive write-up and background notes that I have here, you have more than 60 deals that you've actually put together. And when I was thinking about pharmaceuticals, I wasn't thinking about deals like deal flow, like a PE company, or thinking about mergers and acquisitions. So this really helps to clear it up. These 60 deals are across multiple companies, multiple countries.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about maybe one or two of those to get an idea of kind of what kind of thing happens.
Yeah, well, so I think that in general, it's very different for large and small pharma. And there's a big difference between the in-licensing and the out-licensing side of things, the buy side and the sell side. So, when you're on the buy side or you're big pharma, you're out there looking for assets to fill your pipeline. You're probably looking in a few different therapeutic areas, or possibly you're opportunistic. And that's the way that the ecosystem, taking a step back, we were going to talk a little bit about the pharma space, and you wanted me to introduce that. The way the ecosystem's been working lately is that you sort of have these thousands, hundreds and hundreds of biotechs out there that are these small companies that are just trying to get to a certain phase. Maybe they'll say they want to go and commercialize the product, and maybe eventually they'll grow into that. But for the most part, you see these smaller companies that are out there serving as almost like the development arms of these bigger companies. In the sense, it's expected that licensing and acquisitions will be a part of all of these big pharma companies. None of them, I don't think, have the pipeline to do this on their own. And if you look at the products that are on the market, you'll see that probably half of them are not homegrown products from these big pharma companies. So that's the way the ecosystem is working. So this has become a necessary part of it. So as I mentioned, there's really two sides of it. There's the buy side and the people that are actually searching for these assets, and they're, looking at things a certain way. And then you have people on the sell side that are, have their one or two assets, and sometimes more, and in fewer therapeutic areas. And they're the ones that are out there learning about the space and trying to pump up their asset and find a buyer for it. And I think it's very important to understand how the leverage works in those negotiations, how the deals work, and the timing of those inflection points. So the CBO is sort of the person that's managing that process along with the CEO and
Yeah.
CFO. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So just to think about this, I think I'd always had the impression that the large pharmaceuticals are investing in extensive research to do drug development, and I guess they do that. But you're saying they also are open to looking, especially in certain areas of the pharmaceutical space. They're looking for potential drugs and remedies that they can bring on board, they can purchase. So these smaller, on the sell side, these smaller entities, are they investing in the research and the development of these drugs? They're expert in a particular area typically, and then they're selling them on. Is that how that works?
Yeah, well, I mean, the costs of developing a product are astronomical. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
known. I mean, you're talking in the billions. A single
Hmm.
phase 3 study in one of these large, obesity models that everybody's
Hmm.
focused on right now is in the hundreds
Yeah.
of millions. So, can a small company raise that much money? Is that deemed too risky, as an
Yeah.
investor? Very often you need the larger pharma bank,
Yeah.
but also their experience. Let's give them credit. They've had a lot of success. They've seen what works and what doesn't work, and they have relationships. So I think that very often that's the case. It's not that they're not developing their own pipelines, but the reality is that there are attractive assets out there.
Hmm.
People talk about, well, talking about the cost of this all the way back at the beginning of my career at Pfizer. So this is now 2002, 2003 when I was doing this. Hank McKinnell, who was the CEO at the time, asked the question, said, "Hey, is it more expensive to license a product or to develop it ourselves?" And when you take into account all of the attrition, all the failures of
Right.
developing a
Right.
product yourself, if you can buy a product after it's already cleared all those hurdles, had all of that
Yeah.
risk taken out, and it's in phase 3 or on the market, it
Yeah.
turns out it's about 50-50. I mean, it's about the
Is it
same.
really? Okay.
So you're relatively indifferent. Now, that was years ago that I did this study.
Sure. Yeah.
Imagine that that calculation still pertains here.
Oh,
That it's
sure. I
going
mean,
to, yeah,
I was just going to say in every industry you got make or buy, right? I mean, decisions
right.
all the time. It's a continuing issue, and obviously there's strategic aspects of it as well in terms of how vertically integrated you want to be, and how much you want to not work outside your core competencies, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, in addition to the cost assessment itself. So in the pharmaceutical space, I expect that there's a lot of that kind of analysis that goes on. So as a CBO, you'd have to be expert in all of those calculations and coming up, being almost like a third party expert view of something as well. I expect that even the larger companies would want a third party external view of those kinds of decisions as well. Does that happen?
Yeah, when they go to M&A, when it gets to the
Mhm.
point that you're going to acquire a company, and I think I just saw one announced today for about 8 billion. When you're making an $8 billion purchase, you definitely want to have a third party, and that's where the banks come in. The banks are, especially for these large pharma companies, the banks are
Right.
supporting them. When you're talking about these smaller deals, very often you don't need a bank, but it doesn't hurt to have a third party view on this. And this gets into a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, but I think, everything comes down to incentives. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to be careful here because somebody can be incentivized to be more aggressive or incentivized to be more conservative, and that'll affect the deal. So having that third party weigh in, I think it is very helpful.
So before we get into the story you're going to tell us today, what would you say would be the biggest hurdle right now in the pharma and biotech space that I think everybody's watching and kind of concerned about?
Well, it's basically, I'll give you a general term, uncertainty. And,
Hmm.
I just came back from the JP Morgan conference and feelings are upbeat. Everybody's in a more positive mood, I'd say, about the prospects for moving forward. And we've seen a tremendous amount of deal activity. When we think about how the industry is going, I think it's really about how this machine is working. Can these smaller companies get the funding to develop the products to the point where the big pharmas can pay for them, and will they pay appropriately?
Hmm.
And it's moving. The machine's working. So I think that the machine's working. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought of the question again.
That's all right. Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, so it's just that there's a lot of hurdles out there. So
Oh
I'm
yeah,
glad to
so
hear. I mean,
uncertainty, right?
uncertainty is across every
So
industry these days,
so
and
it's
it's kind of
political. Yeah.
the thing I'm seeing with others is that we're seeing the business flow is still pretty good. There's some deals that are happening. Customer demand is still there, although customer sentiment is weak, and it's like there's a cautiousness because of this uncertainty, and it's kind of sitting right on the horizon, but we're moving ahead. Is it similar? Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, but the uncertainty here is interesting because you're making deals. I mean, the amount of time it takes to develop a drug, at minimum is 10 years. Okay.
Oh,
And
okay, that's a
I mean
long
from
cycle.
the concept to putting it forward and even
Yeah.
if you get into the rare disease space where you can do
Hmm.
quicker trials and all that, it takes a long time and you have a limited
Hmm.
patent life to make your money back. So you have a window. When you don't know what the price is going to be because of price controls or regulations, when you don't know what the
Yeah.
international environment's going to be like, when you don't know what the
Yeah.
competitive landscape, you're making, I mentioned there was a purchase today for $8 billion. You're making an $8 billion bet on how the market's going to look 10 years
Yeah.
from now, 20 years from now. It's that is the riskiest thing you can do, but there's no choice. This is what we do. And,
Right.
we hope that we have a good enough sense of the market and that, the competitive and the pricing and the regulatory environments and
Mm.
you might develop a drug that would have been attractive by the time it's approved, it's old and it's no longer an industry leader. This happens routinely. So, the pharma industry is the riskiest industry, I think. It's innovative space, sort of like the tech industry in the space. It just moves so fast that you have to make
Yeah.
sure that you're staying on top of things, and the earth can move under your feet, and you have to be prepared for that. So that's the largest hurdle, I think, and that's not a new thing. It's just that there's so much uncertainty right now. I think because things are happening that people didn't, expect could ever happen.
Right.
And
Right.
is it possible there's price controls in the future? It's very possible. I mean, they're moving this way with the most favored nations. There's, a lot of risk to the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. Yeah. It seems like it's going to be accelerating. So we'll see where this sorts out. All right. Well, let's turn to the heart of the program. We'd love to hear from you about a key story that you can remember from your career, from your life. Maybe it was overcoming a big challenge, or maybe it was just a huge win in the marketplace, or maybe a little bit of both. So set it up for us. Give us some background. Let us know who the players were, what you were doing, what you were up against, and what the outcomes were, and then let's talk about that.
Sure. I have two quick stories for you, so I'll try to
Okay.
get through these. But the first one is very relevant and recent. In the case of iPoint, I mentioned you. I came in as a chief business officer, and one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
we had to do as a company is figure out who we wanted to be for the future. We were currently, when I came in, a specialty, a spec pharma company that had commercial assets, selling, I don't know, roughly 40 million in sales or so, and growing slowly. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, we had a really exciting development stage asset. And, as I described to you the ecosystem earlier, there's not really the space anymore for these smaller to mid-sized commercial companies. You
Right.
really have these biotech companies and you have these big pharma companies and these other smaller players are often getting squeezed. And we had to decide, do we want to try to do both? We have limited funding. Do we want to develop this asset ourselves? Do we want to out-license it? And it was not, a decision I made on my own, obviously, but I did execute on it. And the team came together, the board, and we decided that we want to sell off the commercial business and become a biotech. And we
Mm-hmm.
went ahead and executed on that into 2022 and early 2023. The lesson that I'd say is that the goals and the parameters I was given was for a certain minimum price. So we're like, okay, go out and sell this asset. The board gives you permission to sell it at roughly this price. Of course, I would go back and forth to the board. They would not be kept in the dark. But we did barely meet that amount on bids that we had, and we moved forward. And I really felt that we could get more. And the thing is, and this gets into the lesson here, is that I personally felt that we could get more, and I was going to put my job on the line to do so. Now, I had no incentive to doing so. I would have gotten plenty of kudos for selling the asset, and it's public about how much it sold for. It sold for 82.5 million up front, plus some future payments. But the bids that I had originally gotten were in the 60 to 65 range, and had been slowly rising. I think that
Hmm.
the important thing here is that when there's no incentive for me to get any more, yet I made the decision to make the case to the board, give me the opportunity to see if we can get more, and we'll do it, and we
Hmm.
did.
Hmm.
So this gets down to incentives. It gets down to leadership. When it's the easy path would have been to say, all right, I'll check my box, I'll get my bonus. I'll sell the deal at the current price, and that would have been that. But I did get a significant percentage more, I don't know, 30% or so, more
Hmm.
than was originally, I guess, anticipated or approved. So, it could have worked out against me, but this is part of leadership, is knowing when to take the risks. This was not done on my own. I was communicating with the board. They were aware of what I was doing, but I
Hmm.
think that the lesson for me here is believe in yourself, but also know the value, and know when to take those risks.
So just curious, a couple questions follow. So when the board was considering the fact that you had an offer in hand, it met the numbers they were looking for, and you were attempting to convince them to give you more time and to let you go out and renegotiate or continue to negotiate on the deal. Were some of the board members hesitant to let that happen? Did they want to take the bird in the hand?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's exactly what it is. That term came up
Mm-hmm.
often. Bird in the hand's
Mm-hmm.
worth two in the bush, and there weren't a tremendous number of buyers in our first round. We did get a lot more when I did go back out, so it was good.
Okay.
But I think that I think that discussion was the critical discussion. That this is why the executives and the board members are faced making these tough decisions. When you have an acceptable offer, when you have an acceptable solution, do you take the risk to improve your situation?
Well, I expect as well during the process of the first negotiation you did when you brought the first offer back, you and your team had done a tremendous amount of work, I expect, to
Yes.
really understand the valuation and to be able to promote the value that you were selling in this case.
Yeah.
And it probably not only I'll ask you the question. I expect you've got a stronger feeling about what the value really was, and as a result, when you went out again, you could share that value in a more robust way because the analytics you'd done, and that's why you were able to achieve more. Was that part of it? Were you able to use that work in a stronger sense of confidence of what value you actually had?
Yeah, I think there's a piece of that. I mean, most companies won't want to share their financial model. I think that the uncertainty is what allows deals to get done. One company thinks it's worth more than the other. It has some kind
Mm-hmm.
of intrinsic value. It allows them to do something new. It gives them a synergy. Whatever the reasons are, you have
Yeah.
to find that hidden value. But I think that in this case, it was more about the competitive, process, the bidding process. We knew that the asset had a lot of value. And by the way, when you're talking about an on-market asset that already has sales history,
Mm-hmm.
then it's a lot easier to forecast than something that is a hypothetical
Yeah.
asset 10 years
Sure.
from now and has a 5% probability of success. So by the way, those deals are easier to happen in a sense because you can
Mm-hmm.
choose to take on greater risk. In this
Yeah.
case, when the value is relatively known, then there's a narrower band. We call it the ZOPA, zone of possible agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That's a negotiating term, but I think that within that band, you want to try to get the higher end of it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So in terms of the leadership lessons for the company, in this case, they were just lucky that they had someone like you who wanted to do a better job than you thought you had already accomplished, even though you met the objectives and had to convince them to let you go and get them more. What kind of lesson would there be in there for the board and for the company as a whole to
Yeah.
make sure that they have people who are really going to the mat to make sure they're on the higher end of that zone of possible agreement?
Yeah, so I think part of it is just making sure you've hired the right people. Having an open communication is critical. I think about, I don't know if you've ever read or listened to the Freakonomics series, but they gave a very good example of how real estate agents are compensated, and they're going to make X amount on a deal. If they get an extra $10,000 for you, they don't stand to make that much extra. Their incentive is to get a deal
Mm-hmm.
done not to get maximize the value. And I think that that applies here as well. So you need to have people that are, doing the right thing for the company. And I think it is tricky. I think it comes down to, properly aligning incentives. This is just a general comment. You don't want to have people that are incentivized to do a deal. You want them to do the best deal. Right?
Right. So you go just looking at that, if you were the chairman of that board or any board doing the same thing that you were just
Yeah.
having discussed here, what would you do to provide the right incentives for the team? I mean, yeah, you can hire the right people, you can get diligent folks who have high integrity and who want to be the best they can be, but I would also like to think that there's some way I could incentivize them to do the best deal. What would you do? Your company, your deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit complex. I think that you'd probably want to structure the financial incentives along the lines of, this is what I try to do in the deals, which is
Yeah.
that you have an agreed upon value, right? And then,
Mhm.
but if it turns out to be more, then there's a greater percentage, somewhere. So, hey, if I got that deal done at X dollars, then here's the bonus. And if I
Right.
get more, then I get a greater bonus, something, to that effect just to align the incentives. I think that it's tricky, right? Because once again, you don't want to push somebody too far and then they lose the deal. But I think that the CBO is not acting in a vacuum here. They're understanding the landscape, they're communicating it, they're communicating the risks, and I think it really is up to the board members and to the CEO to be the
Mhm.
ones making that tough decision about, well, is this
Sure.
worth the risk? So, I don't want to mislead and say this was my decision. This was my recommendation. And
Right.
I think
Right.
that it turned out to be the right one.
Yeah. Good for you. Well, that's great. And if you just think about this in terms of the opportunity in the marketplace, I mean, how much does I know you said you had an existing asset that was on market. You had the market share, the flow. You knew that the pricing was right. But the forward competitive environment, I expect in situations like this is a big part of the uncertainty, right? Now, you don't
Yeah.
know if there's going to be another company that's going to come up with a similar drug some sort of a solution that supersedes your solution or whatever. So how much competitive assessment goes into that? And when you were doing that, how much weight does that get in the decision making process?
Well, I'd say that's more of a buy side responsibility. We're going to be putting forward our best case, and then it's really up to the buy
Mm-hmm.
side to say, well, we see these additional risks. So I've worked both sides. I probably
Right,
spent more
sure.
time on the buy side, but I have spent more of the last 10 years on the sell side.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a buy side responsibility. Look, nobody's going to do your diligence for you. And it's not the seller's responsibility to do your diligence. Ask the questions, we'll give you the answers, but we're not going to go ahead and volunteer, hey, there's a product coming out that we found out about 5 years from now. Do the work yourself. And look, any competent, team is going to do that work. So it's not something that we're concerned about. It really is something about they have to now evaluate more than one asset. They're not just evaluating your asset. They're evaluating
Right.
the landscape and trying to see, well, which ones are most likely to succeed? How are we call them target product profiles? How are these
Mm-hmm.
companies going to compare to each other in terms of efficacy, safety for their compounds?
Mm-hmm.
Likelihood of success, all of those things. And it is a complicated, very complex decision. And it
Sure.
gets back to your question about why do you need a CBO? And I
Yeah.
think it's something that, some CEOs think that they can handle and many can at a high level. And look, many CEOs are former CBOs and they know how to do it, but they do have a full-time job on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And you've been in those roles for quite some time now, and you've been on the buy and sell side, as you said. So if you were structuring the correct amount of responsibility, authority to act, and accountability, how would you design that now? You're thinking about the leadership issue behind this. So really, what we're saying is whether you're a buy side or sell side company, having CBOs who are going to work in the best interest of the transaction, how would delegate the authority? How would you drive their performance, and how would you give them the appropriate amount of accountability, in addition to the incentives that we've already talked about?
Yeah, I think that, it is dangerous for anybody to work in a vacuum. No matter how talented of a CBO are, you're not
Yeah.
going to know everything. You're not going to know everything about R&D and manufacturing and legal and regulatory. It really is a discussion. It is a team
Mm-hmm.
that is coming up with this. Now, the CBO is sort of leading that team. They are the ones that are compiling all this and thinking about how it all fits together. This is one of the lessons I was going to talk about, but everyone on a team thinks their job is the most important. So how do somebody says, well, we have a regulatory concern, and someone says we have a development concern. How do I piece together and say which of these concerns are the most relevant, most valid? Because the board or the CEO is not going to sit there and micromanage down to every level. You need to think about which ones will really impact the value of the deal or whether or not the project will get approved. And you need to be able to filter through that. So that's just experience. That's once again why you hire somebody with 25 years and has been through it and seen a lot. So how I
Right.
would structure it is I would give, the responsibility of the CBO to get all of that filtered down and then to have the discussion with the management team and then the board. It's really the management team handles a lot of this. It's really the board that makes the final decisions, but
So I expect, like any business process, the process of working a deal, doing the program management, getting everyone engaged, getting all the data, that process is really a part of what you provide in your company. You bring not only your experience and your knowledge and insights, but you're bringing a process to pull all this together. That's kind of a proven approach to the business.
yeah, well, my clients, and right now I have a pretty good client roster. They're all different. It's different therapeutic areas, it's different
Mm-hmm.
projects. Some of them are looking to sell a company, some are looking to out-license assets, and some are looking to bring in assets. So I'm really doing everything right now. But yes, I think that having somebody that understands, they say the jack of all trades and master of none. I do view that very often as what I do, which is, I'd say the master of one really is the deal. But understanding regulatory, understanding legal, yeah, understanding, enough about the products and the science and the
Mm-hmm.
commercial space is all important for this role. So you definitely want to structure a team. Now, when I help these smaller companies, they very
Mm-hmm.
often don't have a lot of those resources, right? So I'm stepping in wearing a lot of different hats, and I know enough
Right.
to get to places, to certain decision points. And if we need expertise, we can always bring it in. But yes, you do need somebody that can do all that. And like I said, it's not that the CEOs aren't capable. They become CEOs for a reason. Very often they have deep experience either in development or on the commercial side. I think that nobody knows everything, and it's good to have at least somebody to bounce the things off of, and even provide a barrier. Because if you're speaking to another company and you're the CEO and they say, "Well, we want this," the CEO can't just answer on the spot. If you're a CBO, you can say, "Oh, I have to go back and check," and you need that barrier to be able to provide
Yeah.
some cover.
Little bit of a buffer so you
Yeah,
can step
yeah.
back and reconsider things you hadn't considered before. Well, that's great. Any other insights you want to provide on that in terms of what you think the leadership lessons might be inside this for either a buy side or a sell side company?
Yeah, I mean, I actually would shift to a slightly different leadership lesson because, we talked a little bit about how, I lead these teams, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't have direct reporting responsibility very often for these
Sure.
people, right?
Right.
These are experts in many different fields.
Right.
They could be leaders, they could be, team members, but either way, I very often have one or two direct reports. And even at the biggest companies, they might have a team of 10 to 20 BD people, right? At the biggest companies. And you're still relying heavily on outside expertise. So
Mm-hmm.
the leadership lesson for me came actually early on while I was at Novartis. This was back in 2007. I joined. And all of a sudden, I'm leading these teams of 20 to 30 experts across different areas that I really didn't know much about. And I'm very driven, very ambitious. I want to get deals done. And I'm going in there as if my project is the most important thing they have going on, when in reality, they're not getting incentivized on my product. My project, they are spending maybe 5% of their time on my project. But to me, it's the most important thing. So I'm ordering them around, telling them this is what has to be done at this date, and a little bit rough for the style. And after 6 months or so of this, maybe even less, my boss called me in and said, "Listen, this isn't how things are done." And he talked to me about it, and I changed, I adapted, and what I've developed since then is a very good leadership of a matrix leadership approach. where, it's more done through relationships and asking and understanding where they are, what they can get done, how long things take to get done, rather than just saying, "Hey, we have a deadline, we need it done by this date." How can I help you? How can I help you reach these timelines? Do you need me to call your boss? Do you need me to take something off your plate? So I think that just having that leadership style experience now has really served me well for the last 20 years.
Yeah, I was just, before you said working in a matrix, situation, I was thinking of that as a model for all organizations that have matrix workflows, right? It's a very different dynamic to have the collaboration across teams when there's individual team goals, and then there's the bigger project goal that goes across. So, in my experience, it's exactly what you said. It's respect, it's collaboration, it's teamwork, pulling together, helping one another to get there. And it's also just about showing appreciation and making
Yeah.
sure there's recognition across the entire team. And it sounds to me, Michael, like you're the kind of guy who wants to give recognition and support to other people. And I
Yeah.
expect that's why you were successful in getting a lot of this done, because you gave everyone the feeling that they were a part of something that was special, rather than a part of something that they had to do because you were ordering them to do it. So that's really
Yeah,
good.
well, just to add to that, so BD, business development, is considered the sexy area very often within the pharma industry. I mean, making deals happen, spending $1 billion on buying a new product, a new
Yeah,
company. It's exciting. So people like working on it, but the problem is it's also very secretive. So knowing how much information to share with the team at the appropriate times, because they want to be kept in the loop. They don't want to work on little part and then they get forgotten. They want to hear updates. And so I think there's a proper balance. You don't have to give them minute by minute negotiation
right.
details, but at the same time, keeping them in the loop and also giving them the recognition, I think is also part of keeping the incentives aligned.
Yeah, that's really good input. All right. Well, I really appreciate the fact that you shared those stories and talked about those situations with us. Let's transition to a wrap up of this conversation now. And on this program, I like to ask a couple of questions. First one being, if we were to rewind, let's say 25 years, and you were a younger man, knowing what you know now, what would be the one piece of advice you'd be certain to give yourself?
Yeah, so I'd put it in two parts. One is patience, and the other part is but know your net worth. And the reason I
Mm,
say that is I was a very ambitious person. As I mentioned, when I came into Novartis, I was very hungry and wanted to get deals done and get promoted and all of that. And I think throughout my career, I've always been very hungry. Look, I started as an investment banker. It's certainly a type A personality, type
right.
type of approach. And I think that, and I've seen it with others, and having patience, making sure that you're not annoying the people. Now, most people, senior people, will give their time. Hey, can I, get a half hour of your time? Just get some career advice and just get to know each other, things like that. They give that time, but if you push too
Mhm.
hard, it does rub them the wrong way. The counterbalance of that is, but know your net worth. Because here's
Mhm.
the problem I also have seen, and I've seen it on both sides. I've seen it at me as a manager, and I've also seen it at, for myself, is that, if you don't ask for something, you're not going to get it. If you don't make the
Right.
case for your promotion, if you don't make the case to take on a project, there's no reason for them to give it to you. If you're thinking, especially these bigger companies, they're very happy to continue paying you what you're making. And if you don't know your net worth, if you don't test your value and
Right.
understand and time it appropriately so that you
Mhm.
go to your boss or someone else that you want to work for at the right time to make your case, then it's not going to happen. So I think that, it's really that patience, but
Mhm.
also knowing the right time to do that.
Yeah, so let me rephrase that a little bit just to make
Yeah.
sure I understand. So you're saying for your own kind of health and well-being and personal satisfaction, be a little bit more patient so that that pressure isn't always on you to achieve, achieve, achieve. But at the same time, don't be so patient that you don't understand what you're worth and go and make your case at the appropriate time. So it's really a balance between how aggressive you pursue growth and compensation versus how patient you are and how comfortable you are. And maybe, I'm a kind of student of the scriptures, and we were asked to be patient, right, and to be content with what
Yeah.
we have. So that concept about being content, but then, looking to do more and be more is kind of a nice balanced way to think about that. So that's clever. I like
Yeah.
that.
Well, and just remember, all of these leaders within these companies and within the industry, they've all grown up. Nobody was born a CEO.
Mm,
Nobody had that as their first job. Or
that's
I
right.
shouldn't say nobody. There's very few people they've all worked their way up. So they understand, but you have to also take your time, understand what's necessary, what skills do I need. One of the key things that I did, and I know we didn't go into my background much, but I made sure that I took the time and I had foregone promotions to make sure that I learned a few different roles. So while I was at
Right.
Novartis, for example, I took on director roles of marketing, managed markets, and a head of operations role outside of the business development and strategy focus that I had. And the reason I did that was to grow and to
Mhm.
invest in myself. And I think that's a very smart and patient thing to do is to take the time to invest in yourself.
Yeah, good. All right, let's fast forward the other direction. So, 20 years from now, 25 years from now, we're sitting having a coffee, talking about our lives and our careers. What are you going to tell me you're most proud of?
I think the integrity and ethics side of things, I think that, when you can go to sleep at night and feel good about the work that you've done, when you can, I think very often the incentives are not aligned. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but it's a
Mhm.
lot easier for somebody buying an asset to say no because, you don't get slammed and take the risk of saying yes, right? So at the big companies,
Mhm.
the people are incentivized to say no. And the small companies, your incentive is to sell the asset and get, and say yes. So in the case that I gave you in this first example, it would have been a lot easier for me to just say yes. And at the same time, people in my position, when we're doing the financial modeling, to your point about having a third party look at it, we can very easily influence and use a more aggressive assumption. 1%, 2% here or there makes a huge difference. And you can make
Mhm.
something worth more or less pretty simply. And like I said, the integrity and the ethics that I've had and being able to defend my numbers and with a clear conscience, I think that is something that I'm going to look back on and say, you know what, I've done the right things. There's deals that I've turned down. My goals when I've been at these companies and now I'm on my own, but very often they're, hey, your whole objective for the year, get a deal done. Get one deal done, get
Mhm.
two deals done, whatever it says. Even for
Right,
20
right.
years, that's been my objectives, right? They don't say get a good deal done. They don't say get a deal done and maximize the value. They just say get a deal done. And if my job is on the line, am I going to go ahead and do a bad deal because they're telling me I have to? You're incentivizing me the wrong way. So, I think there's something that needs to be fixed. And as a leader, that's something that I always try. This is one of my things. I always try to understand incentives and motivations. When I'm negotiating with another company, this person I'm negotiating with, what's their incentive? The company, what's their incentive
Sure.
and motivation? Same thing with me, right? So you want to make sure that you're putting the right things in place. And that's why when I look back at it, I can say, despite those incentives, it's saying, hey, get a deal done. I've been able to say no to some deals that I disagreed with.
Well, I've said all my career that human beings in general behave the way we're motivated to behave. So incentivizing, things correctly makes a huge difference in a business. But
Yeah.
also selecting people with integrity, to your point, is critical because you want to know that regardless of whether you've got the processes and the motivational kind of aspects of your business lined up exactly correctly or not, that the people are going to come to the table, with an honest, true representation of what they should be doing with the best interests of themselves, their colleagues, their customers, and their company, and the shareholders, all kind of at the top of the list, where you're trying to keep that balance between what's right and what's needed, in the right perspective. So yeah, good for you. That's a great answer. All right, Michael, great having you on the program. If people wanted to get in touch with you about, you or your business, or to have you speak at an event or whatever it might be, how would they get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, the email is mpine@pinehealthstrategies.com. You can also go to
Mhm.
my website, which is pinehealthstrategies.com.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I look forward to staying in touch with you. Thanks so much for all of your sharing of your perspective and your comments today, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Sounds good, Wayne. Thank you.
All the best and God bless. Well, that's it for Driven to Lead today. We really appreciate you being with us. Share this with a friend or a business colleague if you would. And if I could remind you again, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. We're very grateful for that. So until next time, always remember, the high road leads to a better place.